I'm Marissa Semke in for Brian Lilly. The media party and the progressive spin on prostitution. That's the topic of tonight's byline. Now, before I begin, I'd like to warn our viewers at home that tonight's subject matter is highly sensitive, and some of the content in what I'm about to say is quite graphic and may not be suitable for children. Now, there's an important debate going on in Ottawa right now about Canada's prostitution laws. The Conservative government introduced a bill in early June. I don't think they were itching for this fight. They were forced by the Supreme Court's ruling last December. The court repealed 3 provisions of Canada's prostitution laws, and they gave Parliament 1 year to legislate on it. Now, to be clear, they never prescribed what Parliament can or should do. They just said what Parliament could not legislate. So the Conservatives introduced Bill C-36. This was a bill influenced by the so-called Nordic model that's been popularized in Norway and Sweden. The law would criminalize for the first time in Canadian history the purchase of sex and would target the Johns and pimps who profit from prostitution. Now, there's a sense of urgency to pass this bill because if the bill isn't passed come December, prostitution will be decriminalized across Canada, and we won't be able to put that genie back in the bottle. That's why the Justice Committee's devoted over 20 hours of marathon hearings to listening to over 60 witnesses. We've heard from survivors of prostitution, current prostitutes who refer to themselves as sex workers, community workers, European experts, chiefs of police. The list goes on. There are aspects of this bill, of course, worth debating. And if you're like my colleague and libertarian friend Anthony Furey, you say we can't eradicate prostitution, so we should just legalize and regulate. I don't agree, but it's a legitimate position to hold. But for those who don't support legalization and also don't support the government's bill, well, now's the time to propose amendments. But have you heard any? Both the NDPs and Liberals, and also what we here refer to as the media party, have been highly critical of the bill and yet reluctant to propose any substantive policy alternatives. Rather, they've latched on to certain distractions to avoid them from having to say what it is they actually stand for. What do I mean by that? Well, the first is just send it to the Supreme Court. In effect, let the unelected judges proofread our democratically elected legislators' work before it's voted on.
Have you had time to reflect on the fact that maybe it'd be better at the end of the day, after all the process, to send it to the court right now, which is within the power of the government to do so, to make sure that we don't miss the point and have to redo all over, because you know what, life is short and I hate to waste my time.
That was François Boivin, the NDP's justice critic. She asked Minister McKay repeatedly to send the bill back to the Supreme Court. What is it that she disagrees with, and how would she amend it? But, of course, she's not alone in this. Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister in waiting, is even worse. Trudeau's acknowledged that prostitution itself is a form of violence against women. But when asked how he'd amend the bill or how he'd protect the most vulnerable, he said this.
People have put forward different models, and what we feel is that the government in its approach right now isn't living up to what the Supreme Court asked it to do, which is to make sure that the most vulnerable people, the workers in the sex trade, are protected from violence.
Even allegedly conservative columnist Jonathan Kaye of the National Post wrote this, quote, "Enough with the moralizing. Send the prostitution law to the Supreme Court." This idea of judicial supremacy is taking on new levels of ridiculousness. The court isn't supposed to act as our father, who we have to ask permission before passing laws. The legislative branch passes the laws. The court can strike it down if it's unconstitutional. But Supreme Court references are now becoming a common demand. Why have a parliament at all? Maybe part or all of Bill C-36 will be shot down, or maybe not. We won't know for years, but that's the process. If people don't like that the government of the day is passing legislation that's subsequently struck down, so be it. They can punish the party by not voting for them. But it's clear what the NDP, the Liberals, and the media party, who might as well be a political party, are doing here. They're chirping from the sidelines without actually coming out and saying whether or not they support the buying and selling of women as chattel. If that's what they think, just say it. But if they aren't supportive of legalized prostitution, then give us some policy alternatives, please. Now, the other distraction was, of course, the bizarre interaction that took place between Tamia Nagy and Conservative MP Robert Gogan. Tamia Nagy's a former prostitute and a strong supporter of the government's bill. In committee, she recounted a terrible story of how she was gang raped by 3 Russian men. MP Gogan, in his attempt to debunk the narrative pushed by the Criminal Lawyers Association, asked about freedom of expression. Watch.
You were describing a scenario where you were being raped, I believe, by 3 Russians. Let's suppose the police authorities would have broken in and rescued you. Would your freedom of expression have been any way breached?
You don't understand the question.
If you were rescued, you wouldn't feel that your rights were violated. You don't get it, okay.
Yes, it was poorly worded, but it was his response to those who argue Bill C-36 is a violation of a prostitute's charter right to freedom of expression. Well, the NDP, the Liberals, the media party, they jumped on it. They went crazy. Meet Robert Gogan, the Conservative MP who turned rape into a bad joke. This one, was this the most offensive question ever asked by an MP? Did any one of these journalists bother to ask Tamia her thoughts on Mr. Gogan's question? No, I did. Watch this.
I think it is probably a distraction. It's a very nice and juicy headline for some media outlets, absolutely, which is very sad because, again, when I go back and watch the news on different TV outlets, I honestly don't feel like that they actually reporting what happened in the committee meetings for the last 3 days. I feel like that the media, the majority of the media is reporting something completely different and coming up with facts that they don't even exist, and I'm very frustrated, and I'm actually almost feeling like I'm back in a communism where the media was controlled by someone.
So the woman at the center of this controversy wasn't offended. She calls it a distraction because her message isn't getting across because the media is focused on a sexy headline. These people actually re-victimized Nagy by telling her how offended she was by using her as a pawn against the legislation she's working so very hard for. How paternalistic is that? And the sad thing is it's working because no one's talking about any of the substance of the bill that, if not passed, will open the door to de facto legalization in Canada. Now, I'll leave you with this. The woman who's become the face of the Supreme Court challenge, Terri Bedford, she's a dominatrix, will say, "This is my choice, and how dare the government criminalize my chosen line of work?" I want to read you part of the court's documents from 2010 that refer back to when Bedford first entered the prostitution industry as a minor. And you tell me if you think this is a profession that women truly enter out of their own free will. Quote, "At the age of 16, she met an abusive 37-year-old drug dealer and drug addict who became her live-in boyfriend. He introduced her to drugs and she became addicted. Ms. Bedford says that she began prostituting as a, quote, necessary evil to fund her and her boyfriend's addictions. She stated she was raped and gang raped too many times to talk about, beaten on the head with a baseball bat, and tortured physically and psychologically. She added, when a streetwalker goes to meet a John, she never knows what will happen to her." My heart aches for this poor woman, but she's not alone. Many say the average age of entry into this industry is between the years 13 and 14 years of age. And just as Terri Bedford was subject to certain vulnerabilities that conspired to ultimately keep her there, so are the vast majority. This is the industry the NDP, the Liberals, and the media party won't speak out against. But we are, and this is why I support Bill C-36. And that's the byline.